Like to me, everything's about breathing, right? Like to me, everything is about like take full ownership for everything and then everything gets easy because then you're in control. And then learn how to love to lose. Like for me, my game's simple, right? It's all my fault. So now I'm not mad at Lindsay or D-Rock or, that's it, my fault. I'm empowering them. So it's actually true. My fault. Now, oh, we lost this or this didn't deliver or we fucked up. All right, it's an L. Like everybody's got losses. You know, it's funny, when UFC started getting popular, I started using it to paint the picture. I'm like, look, business and entrepreneurship is much more UFC than it is boxing. In boxing, a loss is devastating. Like, you know, if you ever, you know, I'm a big boxing fan, like most big fights, like the big fights through the year, almost, it's just unbelievable amounts of 33-0 versus 35-0, right? Just like, that's like what you do. You don't fight anybody and you get to that level. Everybody's got losses in the UFC. And so I think that's how entrepreneurship, that's how life is. We all have losses. And so I like losses. I love adversity. I like the climb. I like the chip on my shoulder. I like when people are like, oh, I knew it. He's not that good. That is like I'm even weirdly scared as I continue to ascend and I'm getting popular and what do you say, the marketing leading, like as people start putting these words in front of my name, I'm like, am I gonna sabotage myself to like recorrect this? Like I like adversity. So yeah, all on me. You know, I enjoy losses. Now all of a sudden, like what? You become completely invincible. I feel invincible. I really genuinely, outside of the health of myself and 20 people, feel 100% invincible as a person.
I think there's a very, very important lesson in my story. Most people don't realize that when I started Sun with Scott McNeely, we started another company a month earlier. And when I see audiences like this, I always ask them, do you remember what company I started and failed at?
Crazy.
And nobody can tell. It was a company called The Data Dump. And my point is the following. Your failures don't matter if they're manageable failures. My life wasn't going to end if the data dump failed. I'd be a little bit behind on my rent, but I'd pick up and start again. And we started both Data Dump and Sun about a month apart, same founders. And my point is failure doesn't really matter if it's not going to kill you. Success, on the other hand, everybody remembers 40 years later. And it changes your life. And frankly, the failures also are probably one of the more important learning moments in your life. So I just want to emphasize what seems like a large risk may actually, in the context of 10, 20, or 30 years, be a very small risk because nothing about you changes. Maybe you're a little bit smarter.
But my point is, people don't remember your failures. And I like to say my willingness to fail is what gives me the ability to succeed. I find most people are so afraid of failing, they don't try and do the things that would be important enough to do. Anything worth doing is hard. So, look, it would take an hour to talk about all my mistakes. I actually, let me put it this way. In the last 15 years, there's only once in my life I've called somebody and say, I'd like to speak at this conference. And that wasn't a popular conference. It was a small thing in a hotel room in San Francisco, and it was called FailureCon, where everybody who had failed came. And I wanted to speak to this issue of failure. There are so many stupid things. You know, the iPad is so popular. We tried to do it. Probably one of my large mistakes in the late 80s. And I can go into details, and I'll cut it short. What I would say is I'm never embarrassed about my failures. And so if you search on the web for my failures, you'll find lots of them, and you'll find me talking about them. And it's important because given my philosophy, where I screw up doesn't matter because it's a long list. In fact, it's a longer list than my successes. But like I started with, nobody remembers the data dump here. Everybody remembers Sun, right? The number of venture companies where I made stupid mistakes. I'll tell you one of my big failures. So if you go back to Sun, 1980s, Sun's logo or motto under the logo was the network is the computer. And these couple of people started this software program that did routing of IP packets or network traffic. That happened to be the beginning of Cisco. Now, when you say the network is the computer and make these arrogant marketing lines, and you forget that routing is the key element, and Cisco was born as an application on Sun, and we didn't see it. And I said to myself, duh, how stupid was I not to see it when it was happening, even when I saw the application. A router was an application on a Sun machine. We missed the largest opportunity Sun could have. I can find 100 such examples. The point is, try and fail, but don't fail to try. A couple of other favorite quotes along those lines, since we're coming to the end of our time. Robert F. Kennedy said, only those who fail greatly can succeed greatly. The classic example of that is Elon Musk. Right? He said, forget this bullshit about supplying batteries to GM. They're just too slow to make change happen. You know, I was talking about retailing, Amazon, not Walmart, YouTube, not NBC. Think about GM or Tesla. GM spent way more money than Tesla did. NASA and Lockheed spent way more money than SpaceX did. I can go on and on. Every major change. So failure, try and fail, but don't fail to try. Nassim Taleb, in his book Anti-Fragile, which I recommend everybody read if they're setting off on a career as a personal philosophy. Mine happens to coincide, and I'm not talking about Black Swan, but his book called Anti-Fragile. I always love ending with a good book recommendation. I think that's important. So I'm just not embarrassed about my stupid mistakes. I mean, I think that's the difference.
I think that here's what's really fascinating is that, you know, and I'm not sure if I'm going to say this right, and I know that somebody whose name I can't remember has said this much better than me. The degree of success that you will have in your lives and that I will have in my life is not related to how hard I work, or it's related to how high a degree of failure I'm willing to tolerate in my life. And so if I'm only willing to tolerate a very small amount of failure, I'm going to keep taking relatively safe things that have relatively limited downside, but will also, because that's the nature of things, when don't have a lot of upside. So the guy who lunges for a career in law, or career as a consultant, or career as all these careers where the sort of the outcomes are relatively narrow. You start with a relatively high salary, but where it pans out 10 to 15 or 20 years later is a slightly higher salary or a partnership salary, but it's not sort of many, many multiples of what you could expect to get. That's somebody who doesn't want to tolerate a very high degree of failure in their lives. And then you get people like Ted Turner, who spent vast amounts of money, of his own and other people's money, building up cable news network, the first news network that was nationwide, that was on cable, that wasn't one of the broadcast networks at the time. And he was willing to invest 5, 6, 7 years of his life into something that might ultimately fail. So he was, and I suspect that if we look closely, and I'm afraid I don't know this, if we look closely at his life, we'd probably find a lot of major, massive failures. And another guy that we can talk about is that we all know a little bit better is Steve Jobs. I mean, he was fired from his own company. He spent a number of years out in the wilderness. So my life, in a certain way, when you look at the failures in my life, they just don't compare to some of the bigger failures that other people who are way more successful than me that have had. Today I was reading about Freddie and Fannie. It turns out that they've had some major judgment. These guys who invested in whichever securities, Bill Ackman is one, and this guy Bruce Berkowitz is another, and one or two others are all losing large amounts of money because they made major bets on Freddie and Fannie, and it turns out, at least in the latest decision, that it's unlikely that they're going to win. And so they're tolerating major failure. Bill Ackman lost on his Freddie and Fannie position $175 million, according to the Wall Street Journal today. And he's a guy who's willing to fail big because he's got the fortitude and the courage and the moral or the depth of personality to take that, because he knows that over time he'll do extraordinarily well. He's a guy who in a certain way lives much larger than I do. I think if I'd been willing to fail as big as he has done, I would have had an awful lot more success financially and career-wise today.
What advice would you offer?
My number one thing would be to floss regularly. I think that's probably the most important thing that I could add to this class. I'm not sure if there's anything else. Bill, do you have something to contribute?
Sure. So the piece of advice I give to when I have the chance to speak to young people, particularly young people who go to schools like Harvard, is the problem with where you are in life right now is that in order to get to Harvard, you probably have not made many mistakes on your path here. Meaning, you probably graduated something close to the top of your class in high school. You probably did really well on your SATs. You probably, had some great summer interesting experiences. You got great recommendations. You had to live a pretty, successful path, and then you go to Harvard, and you're surrounded by that group of people, and you're on your way to the next thing. And the problem with that experience set is that success depends on principally how you deal with failure, and you've had very little experience in failure. And the lesson sort of my words are, what is experience? And experience is making mistakes and learning from them. So you have to come to learn to treasure mistakes, and also you have to come to learn that you are going to experience a series of unfortunate events over the course of your life. It's a certainty, right? At some point, your parents, one or more, will pass away. You may have your own health issue or someone close to you. Relationships work and some fail. Marriages work and some don't. And you'll take a job, and maybe it's even the first job out of school, and you'll fuck up. Okay, and maybe you get fired. And you look at the list of successful people. I think just thinking, my Bloomberg screen is up just to the left of the Zoom call. Mike Bloomberg was fired from Salomon Brothers, right? And that firing catalyzed him to build a company. But anytime something really bad happens, you have to figure out why it's good. And it's always the case that bad turns into good. My first investment firm, ultimately I had to shut it down, which was a fairly ignominious end to something that we were on a very, very good path on for a meaningful period of time. But that was good. Why? Because it allowed me to start Pershing Square. And with all the experience I had at my first fund, and interestingly, investors were extremely interested in investing because I had made mistakes and because therefore I had experience. And I think that's really super important lesson. So don't be afraid of failure. America in particular loves second acts. In the venture-backed world, people really like entrepreneurs who've fallen, dusted themselves off, gotten up, figured it out. But I think the most successful people in the world have had to overcome. Think about Reed Hastings. His business was mailing you 3 CDs. Okay, and he's competing against Blockbuster, And he tried to sell his company to Blockbuster for 50 million, and they turned him down. Right? Think about that because he was trying to make it work, and he could barely make it work, and he was afraid of this, multi-billion-dollar competitor. But he failed to sell it to Blockbuster, and now, what's that business worth today? Hundreds of billions of dollars. So just look at every failure as an opportunity, and if you do that and you don't get discouraged, you're going to succeed.
I think that's great advice. I mean, it's not as good as flossing, but as a second bit of advice, it's good.
Actually, to Paul's point, let me actually take Paul's very humorous comment and turn it into something serious, which is you cannot succeed unless you're healthy. And the time to start being healthy is when you're 22. And that's, the keys to healthiness are nutrition, exercise, sleep, and also not doing stupid shit, which is what young people do. Like, driving drunk, doing, just dumb stuff, where the laws of probability occasionally mean that you're going to die doing it, even if the chances of your dying are only 1 in 20, whatever kind of stupid risks people take.
One formulation of one of Bill's points was that sometimes that the most successful people are the least accustomed and comfortable with failure. They're the least accustomed to failure, and so they're the least comfortable with it. And that creates a fragility because of the fear of failure that they have, because they've just succeeded at everything they've ever tried. And that leads to a suboptimal risk aversion, right? And one of the things that I've said to people is, show me someone who's succeeded at everything they've ever done. That person might say, well, people say, wow, what a winner. Wow, that person wins at everything they ever do. I say, show me someone who's succeeded at everything they've ever done, and I'll show you someone who hasn't reached far enough. Because the only way you know what you're capable of is to reach for something that you don't know whether you can do. And then sometimes you surprise yourself. And that's how you stretch, and that's how you really explore your boundaries. But one of the things that I think is endemic to our classmates is that many of them would only take steps where their probability of success was really high, because they didn't have the experience of failing and then learning, wow, I can fall on my face and then pick myself back up and go. And this is a very powerful lesson that Bill has learned. I mean, Bill has the resilience to do it, but he also learned the lesson of it, which enabled him to try things that other people wouldn't try and much more thoroughly explore his boundaries, right? And life is much more resilient and forgiving than you realize, provided that your failure isn't because of character. If your failure is because of character, it's a whole different world, right? If your failure is like, hey, look, I tried something really ambitious, it didn't work, so be it. If you fail because you did something wrong, that's a hard one, right?
And even so, you can recover from it. Look at Mike Milken, right? People forget now that Mike Milken at one point was sent to jail for 10 years and had to pay like $1 billion fine. The sentence was later reduced to, 2 years. But I think the guy's made an unbelievable recovery. I think he's extremely widely respected. He's done a ton of great work in medical research, cancer research, prostate cancer, etc. So you can even recover from that. Yeah. But to Paul's point, the interesting thing about character versus even business success is everyone can have exemplary character. It's just a choice.
Yeah.
Whereas some of this other stuff, requires some kind of acumen or hard work or whatever. But character is just a choice.